Welcome back. In this video I'd like to present the autonomic nervous system. And to do that I want to take you back to the very first video of the nervous system and remind you that the nervous system has two major components. We have a central nervous system and a peripheral nervous system. And within the peripheral nervous system, the part that goes out to the body itself, there were two components to that. We have the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. This is our topic today, autonomic nervous system. The somatic nervous system is that part of the body, that part of the nervous system where if you want to move your arm, you have to generate a nerve impulse that goes down a neuron to contract a muscle and so on and so forth like that. The autonomic nervous system is that part of the nervous system that you don't think about. You don't have to think about it. It does it for you, autonomically, like automatically, but it's autonomic nervous system. Autonomic, auto self. The transmission of impulses, whether we're talking about the saltatory transmission where it jumps from node to node, or we're talking about the synaptic transmission from the end of one neuron to a muscle or the end of a neuron to another neuron, those stories are the same in both of these types of nerves. But there's some very different things are true about them, and that's what I'd like to focus on right now. To get into that, I want to take you back to a topic from a previous video actually, and that's the heart. We described heart rate as an average of 72 beats per minute. But we also know that 72 beats per minute isn't satisfactory all the time, and your body has greater demands for oxygen at some times and greater demands for nutrients at some times, so that the circulation of those things has to be faster, so the heart rate can be sped up. Now we also know that the nodal tissue in the heart, in the right atrium of the heart, is connected to the medulla oblongata. And there's a nerve that goes to the SA node that speeds up the heart when those needs for oxygen and nutrients are greater. We describe that as vagus nerve number 10. Well, it stands to reason that if you can speed it up, it doesn't stay elevated forever, so it has to be slowed down as well. So what we have now is not a single nerve or a single neuron involved. We actually have multiple neurons involved in controlling heart rate. At the time when we mentioned this, it was sufficient just to say that's how it's controlled. But in fact, the autonomic nervous system has two subdivisions. It has a sympathetic part, and it has a parasympathetic part. Para is a prefix that means along beside. So you have a paramedic, a person who works along beside a medic. So we have a sympathetic and a parasympathetic nervous system, and these are both subdivisions of the autonomic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system, just in general, is that part that speeds things up. It gets your body ready for increased activity. And the parasympathetic is the one that brings it back down to normal. The exception, and I'll put it right here as a very important thing not to forget, is that the parasympathetic will increase digestive activity. Normally we think of it as the sympathetic increases everything. The sympathetic increases your heart rate. Your sympathetic increases the various parts of your body that get you ready for increased activity, your breathing rate, things like that. And parasympathetic brings things back down to normal. But with digestion, it's the opposite. Parasympathetic will increase digestion. If you increase sympathetic stimulation, that actually decreases digestion. So that's an important part to remember. These two things are antagonistic. These two parts of the autonomic nervous system, they work in opposition to each other. So there's a number of contrasts that we can identify. And there's actually 5 contrasts. And at this time, I think it's useful for me to suggest that when you can find things like contrasts, where there's a certain number of things that can be contrasted, it's probably a good idea to organize that information into a data table, because you can put a lot of information in that kind of a framework. So what I'd like to do is construct a data table over here, which will allow me to contrast 5 things between the parasympathetic, sympathetic, and the sympathetic nervous system. So to do that, I'm going to put sympathetic here. I'll put parasympathetic here. And I've made my point here, so I'm going to take this space away now and use it for the first column. On what basis of contrast that I want to explain between those two parts. So now what we have is a nice little way to organize information. We've already mentioned the first basis of contrast, and that is their antagonistic nature. So just in terms of the heart rate, sympathetic will speed it up, gets your body ready for increased activity, and parasympathetic slows it down. So that's their action. Again, I'm going to put not digestion here, because sympathetic increases activity but not digestive activity, so will not increase your swallowing or your secretion of saliva and that kind of stuff, which is all related to digestion. Parasympathetic decreases activity, but it increases digestion. It stands to reason that if you've got 2 different types of neurons, sympathetic neurons and parasympathetic neurons, which are both now affecting the heart, the SA node, which is my illustration here, they can't be affecting it the same way. They must be affecting it with different neurotransmitters. Because if they had the same neurotransmitter, the heart muscle wouldn't know what to do. It wouldn't know whether it was supposed to speed up or slow down. So there must be different chemicals that they're releasing. Remember, the neurotransmitters in synaptic transmission were those things inside the vesicles. They get released, they cross the synaptic gap. So the neurotransmitter difference sympathetic has a neurotransmitter called noradrenaline. This one is acetylcholine. Very different molecules. They do opposite things, which allows me right away to suggest that if there's different neurotransmitters involved, the enzymes that break down those neurotransmitters and get the synaptic space ready for the next action has to be different as well, because the enzymes are very specific. The enzyme that works on noradrenaline cannot match the one that works on acetylcholine. So the synaptic enzyme. This is an awkwardly large name. But it is an enzyme, monoamine oxidase. This one's also awkwardly large, but it makes a little bit more sense. It's called acetylcholine esterase. Acetylcholine, so you get that, and then esterase, monoamine oxidase. A fourth difference between them is that in this system, and it's true for all of the neurons, these neurons, all the neurons of the sympathetic parasympathetic system, the autonomic nervous system is a motor neuron effector system only. There are no sensory neurons in this system. They're only motor neurons. It all starts from the central nervous system. They're peripheral nerves. They come out of here and they do things in the body, all of them. There's nothing in the body saying, okay, we better send a message off to the central nervous system. Because if you think back now to the example we had here, the need for the oxygen was registered in the aortic arch. The need for heart rate increase is not detected by a sensory nerve that says, oh, we need more heart rate here. And the need for breathing is not detected by a sensory neuron. It's detected by carbon dioxide level in the brain. So there is no sensory component to that. These things are motor fibers only. And what we actually have here is a two motor neuron effector system, which doesn't make a lot of sense when you say it like that, but let me explain it. If we think about the typical pattern where we have the central nervous system, we have a sensory nerve coming in, and we have a motor neuron that takes a message out along an axon. That's the normal, and here's the effector out here. That's normal. But here we have a two motor neuron effector system. There's two motor neurons involved in each one of these. So we have, I'll just draw it like that, a motor neuron that takes an impulse out to a synaptic gap that's somewhere in the body, and another motor neuron. So we go motor neuron to motor neuron, and this is an axon. This is an axon. This is a ganglion. Somewhere in the body that contains the synapses. The difference in these, the difference between the sympathetic and parasympathetic two motor neuron effector system is in terms of the location of these ganglions. In the sympathetic nerves, this ganglion is located very close to the central nervous system. So what we say is that the fiber that goes to the ganglion in the sympathetic nervous system is a short fiber. So this is a short pre-ganglionic fiber. And then the one that goes to the effector is a long fiber. So this is fiber length, is a way to summarize that one. This is a short pre-ganglionic fiber. And a long post-ganglionic. In fact, located very close to the spinal cord, if I represent the brain here, looking at a person's back, there's the brain, and the spinal cord runs down the person's back. Very close to the spinal cord on both sides, there is a nerve trunk. And along that nerve trunk are all the sympathetic ganglions. They're all along here. So this thing here is called a sympathetic nerve trunk. And just by the way I've drawn it, you can see that the little bit of an axon here going to the ganglion is very short. So it has a short pre-ganglionic fiber and a long post-ganglionic fiber. And this thing exists on both sides, obviously. The opposite is true for the parasympathetic fibers. These are long pre-ganglionic fibers. And short post-ganglionic fibers. So the ganglions for the parasympathetic neurons are located very close to the effector. So it could be that a person has a swollen ganglion in their wrist or in their hand because the fiber goes that far, the axon ends, the ganglion exists where the synapse exists, the ganglion is there, and the next motor neuron is from there, but you can have a swollen ganglion. They can be quite painful, swollen ganglion. They're close to in the extremities, close to where the effectors are located. The final one, I said there's 5. The final one is their origin. In the central nervous system. And I can use this diagram here to explain that, but I'm going to get rid of a little bit of extra information here. Way back in the first video of the nervous system, we described the different parts of the spinal cord. We have the cervical part here, the thoracic part, which corresponds to the chest, the lumbar part, which is the lower back, and then the sacral part. And we have nerves that come out from all parts of the spinal cord like that. All these peripheral nerves come out. We also have cranial nerves that come out from the brain, and we said there were 10 pairs of cranial nerves from the brain. These sympathetic and parasympathetic fibers actually originate from different locations in the central nervous system. And the way I always remember it, and it may be handy for others to remember it as well, is the sympathetic part, sympathetic fibers originate from the more central parts of the central nervous system. So they actually originate from the thoracic and the lumbar. And I remember it because sympathetic and central have the same S sound, and it's just easier that way. So these originate from the thoracic and lumbar. And parasympathetic originate from actually the cranial and the sacral, not from the cervical. Sacral. So just to bring it back to where we started, we have the heart. Just for example, we have the heart. Now we know that that SA node is connected not to one nerve but to 2 nerves, and one of them comes out of the thoracic part of the spinal cord, and one of them actually comes out of the cranial part here. Right? The medulla oblongata is up here. That's the parasympathetic, and that's the sympathetic one. In our next video, we'll take a closer look at what happens when you have massive stimulation of the sympathetic nervous system. If you enjoy my videos, please let others know about them. Thank you very much.